give people a few more minutes.
Maybe to be safe.
Yeah. May I ask, has some people seen the exhibition already? Not yet. Oh, a couple of you. Okay. But some will go over afterwards?
Yes.
Great. See our copyright information. Working with Graceland, they are very careful about the images. But as you will see, photography is fine over the road. So you're welcome to take photographs. And maybe may I ask one more question? Sorry, I'm doing extra signing before we start. Which is, do people know Elvis's story quite well? Would you say like so? So what I will do is give you some sort of background ideas rather than tell the story of the exhibition, because you will have already seen it or you will see it in a minute. You reckon, should we get started? Yeah. So welcome everybody. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're on the lands of the Judgerung people here in Bendigo Art Gallery, and the Tangerang people also in the city of Greater Bendigo, and pay my respects and the respects of our team at the gallery to elders past, present and emerging. And yeah, it's an honour to work on this country. So thank you for coming to see the little intro to Elvis direct from Graceland. I'm just going to show you a few images. First of all, this is my photograph of Graceland, which I was very lucky to visit in January after about a year and a half of working long distance, which was great but tricky. So when the borders opened, I was like a bat out of hell to Memphis in January, which meant I was there in Memphis winter, which lasts for about 8 weeks, and I was there for some of it. So I got to see Graceland in its Christmas mode, because the house is decorated every Christmas with decorations from Elvis's lifetime, which was just beautiful. And yeah, got to see the house at night and in the day, which was just absolutely wonderful. Don't worry, there are not too many selfies.
Does it snow in Memphis?
Well, it does, and in fact they have just had a big blizzard when Angie from Graceland, who's the head of archives, was here with us. She was messaging with her team at home that they were having a big, I guess it must have been February, or blizzard. So yes, it does. I don't think it snows every year, but it does snow. And everyone in Memphis told me, in America, said this is not snow, this is a flurry. I was like, to an Australian, this is snow. I'm taking a selfie. And the other thing I did was get to see all the other, pack in many other Memphis sites that relate to Elvis's history. So this is me at Sun Records, his first, as you all know, his first record label, recording studios that you can visit in Memphis and stand on the spot where he recorded his first songs. And this is me at Lansky's, which is the clothing store that he shopped at basically for his whole kind of adult life, but especially who really shaped his look in the 50s that we'll come back to. So I thought the first thing that I thought I would talk about was childhood poverty. So So, as most people know, Elvis's story is sort of a rags to riches story. He was born in Mississippi, in a little wooden shack that essentially his father had built the year before he was born. And the Presleys were very poor. So Vernon was actually jailed for cheque forgery. They had very insecure income and housing. It was the middle of the Great Depression, well, just after the Great Depression. So he really grew up in a very difficult time. And you'll see that we tell a bit about this story in the exhibition. But I think the sort of experience of poverty in childhood really shaped Elvis in so many ways. So I think it, it really gave him a sort of enjoyment for life's luxuries and a sense of like living large while the going was good, and this constant feeling of like it could all disappear tomorrow. And another thing about growing up in poverty is that his parents were accustomed to keeping everything. They did not throw things away, which is part of the reason Graceland has this extraordinary archive of material today. Like the Presleys kept like furniture receipts from 2 years before they moved to Memphis. So the kinds of things that, in the ordinary household you would not necessarily have, but it means we have an amazing record today. And I just wanted to point out a couple of objects to look out for when you go through the exhibition if you haven't already. You'll see the first few things you see really relate to Elvis's experience of religion and church. So obviously church was a huge part of life for most communities in the South, certainly for the Presleys. And some of the first things you see are little prayer, like hymnals, like gospel music books that the Presleys would have used to sing with. And if you know Elvis, you know that gospel was a huge influence and a huge part of his musical life. It was the category for which he won his Grammy Awards in the 60s, and he had auditioned to be in a gospel quartet just before his solo career took off. So he was passionate about gospel music, and towards the end of the exhibition, look out for a record player, which is just sort of in the second to last bit opposite the motorcycle, and it's the record player from his bedroom, kept exactly as it was the day he passed away. And the record on it is labelled The Stamps, and you can see it's just a private pressing from a recording studio in Nashville, in Tennessee. And it was J.D. Sumner and The Stamps were a gospel group that Elvis loved and collaborated with a lot during the 70s. And so it would have been them in the recording studio sending him a copy to listen to, and that was probably the last thing he was listening to before he passed away. So you get this beautiful sense of how important gospel music was all the way through. Oh, wrong way. So a couple more photos, and you'll see lots of photos in the exhibition, or you may already have, but I also wanted to talk about Memphis. So Memphis itself is a huge story that we could only just touch on in the exhibition, and if you ever have the opportunity to go to Memphis, and if you haven't been already, I highly recommend it. It's this fascinating crossroads of American histories. It's, the Mississippi River, which was this sort of like artery of colonial wealth and power and control. So much happened in the South. First Nations people were moved on from areas that were turned into cash cropping for colonial plantation owners. There were sort of boom and bust economies of cash cropping in gin and cotton and tobacco. And then when the Depression hit around the time that Elvis was coming along, the state was incredibly poor. It was one of the poorest places in America. But culturally, it was incredibly rich because it had all of these different emancipated black communities, white agricultural communities, immigrant communities from all over the South came to Memphis. And the Presleys moved there when Elvis was 13 because it was sort of a bigger, thriving city compared with Mississippi, where he was born, and elsewhere in the South. And it had sort of benefited from, by the time they moved there in the 40s, wartime industry factories were set up there, and there was sort of a bit of a healthier economy. So Elvis kind of emerging in Memphis, he really couldn't have sprung from any place on earth. It was this musically incredibly rich city, and of course today, Memphis still really brands itself around its music culture. This is a quote from a musician who was in the house band for Stax Records. So there were all these different record labels there. The records industry has really moved to Nashville these days, but Memphis certainly at this time, had this incredibly healthy culture of radio. This is Dewey Phillips, who was the Memphis radio DJ, who was very influential, as were others, who was the first radio DJ to play Elvis on the radio. So after, I should say this is Sam Phillips, again, apologies if you know this. So this is Elvis's his first record producer. So in the exhibition, you'll see the story of little Elvis going to this studio in Memphis, trying out, pestering and pestering. He pays to record a couple of songs. Sam isn't really that impressed. About a year later, Sam hooks Elvis up with two other musicians, Scotty and Bill. And Elvis at this time, he sort of thinks he's going to be like a ballad singer. So he's singing these sort of sentimental ballads, which were quite popular in pop music. And Sam is just totally not impressed. And then in a break, the guys start fooling around famously with That's All Right. And Sam is like, that's the sound. Let's get it on record. And I think the next day took it to Dewey to play on his radio show. And Dewey was kind of notoriously a harsh critic. If he didn't like records, he would smash them on the ground. He was a big personality, had an alcohol problem. He's got his own, that's a whole other story. But Dewey loved it, and legend has it that he played it 14 times. His switchboard lit up all night, and he tried to get Elvis to come in for an interview on air that night. Now, Elvis at home was so nervous, knowing that his record was going to be played, that he'd gone and hid at the cinemas. So his dad had to run down to the Memphian cinema, get him out and say, you've got to come to the radio station. Dewey wants to talk to you. So all of these other players in the music scene are a huge part of how it was that Elvis was kind of, appeared to emerge overnight and just became this incredible sensation. And really it was that he, emerged in this city with this incredible kind of music infrastructure. And the other thing that goes hand in hand with that cultural scene was the fashion scene in Memphis at this time in the 50s. So this is an ad actually from the 1960s from the clothing store Lansky Brothers, which is still going in Memphis today. That was Hal Lansky with me in one of those first photographs. So Lansky Brothers was this very clever young clothing store catering to this kind of music scene in Memphis. So they had lots of young black avant-garde musician clientele. All kinds of kind of cool musicians would go and shop at Lansky's. And Elvis would window shop before he had any money. And then when he started earning his own money, he and Bernard Lansky, who was the owner at that time, essentially kind of struck up a sort of sponsorship deal. It wasn't quite a formal deal, but Bernard was like, I will help you perfect your look. I will dress you for television, and you just tell everyone, like, I shop at Lansky's. So Lansky's really made a name for itself, and that itself, in terms of fashion history, that is also a whole other story. They dressed people like Johnny Cash, B.B. King, I think, lots of other music stars, and Lansky's really moved with the times. So through the 60s and 70s, they totally stayed at the cutting edge of fashion. So in the 60s, they were selling all these kind of slim Carnaby Street mod outfits. In the 70s, they went to sort of like a Superfly kind of pimp, dandy kind of look. So yeah, Lansky's are really fascinating. But certainly in the 50s, you can see how Elvis is really like sculpting and honing his look. He's growing his pompadour hair, getting more and more outlandish with his clothes and collars. And I guess what's fascinating to us as an art gallery looking at visual culture is Elvis really styled himself before celebrities had stylists. He kind of, just from his sort of creative instincts and from being in this kind of very cool musical city with all these different cultural influences, he kind of put together this look that still today prevails so strongly, that like his hair, his silhouette is so identifiable to us, and constantly referenced in design. Once you start looking for it, you'll see Elvis everywhere, especially in Bendigo at the moment. So the other couple of characters that we kind of wanted to weave through the exhibition were Graceland itself as a house, because I think just the word Graceland evokes such sort of powerful ideas. It's such a strong symbolic site. Obviously, you know, it's a site of like fan pilgrimage, but I think, you know, it's probably one of the most identifiable names in the world and the second most visited historic home in the United States after the White House. So it's, you know, it's Graceland herself is kind of part of the story. Elvis purchased Graceland, as you will see or have seen, when he was really young, 22. It was the second, he did buy a suburban home before Graceland, but it didn't really work. It was in the burbs in Memphis. The neighbours were sick of the fans at the gate every night. So pretty soon afterwards, in 1957, so really at the beginning of his career, his parents saw this house and put a down payment down immediately. They were so taken with it. And, you know, there's a lot of, in the Elvis story about he really bought this house for his mother, that he was, you know, incredibly close to his mum Gladys. And really, you know, as a kid, he would always say, I'm going to grow up and be rich and buy you a house. And of course, Gladys only really got to have this as her family home for a year because she quite unexpectedly died in 1958 when Elvis was in Texas doing his pre-departure kind of army training at one of the forts there. And I think, you know, the combination of he loved this house, he loved Memphis, and because it was the house he bought for Gladys, he never sold Graceland. And he was, you know, you'll see in the exhibition we mentioned, he was asked more than once, you know, oh, will you sell Graceland? And after he comes back from the army, one of the journalists said, now that your family situation has changed, kind of alluding to, now that Gladys has died, will you sell the house? And he says, I have no plans to sell Graceland. So we kind of wanted to bring the house into the exhibition as best we could. There's no substitute for seeing the real thing, but you'll see we've got some glimpses of it. And the wonderful thing about working with the Graceland archives is that we were able to borrow some very special, intimate, personal things like that record player, like his bedside table, his wallet, you know, things from the home to Bendigo for the exhibition, which is, you know, the kind of thing that, you know, you really can't do with loans just assembled from private collectors and memorabilia. It's something that's very unique to the home itself and the archives there. So of course, another very important character is Priscilla Presley, who is instrumental to the Graceland story. She was really kind of the lead behind the move to turn Graceland into a public site, into a tourist destination in 1982, when the estate was in big financial trouble. And as you've probably read in the media, if you're following this story, you know, she was under all this pressure from the lawyers and the accountants to just sell Graceland, square up, get back in the black. It was a very expensive property to maintain, and Elvis was no longer bringing in income, of course, after he died. So Priscilla, you know, basically undertook this huge project to preserve the house, you know, both for Lisa Marie, but also for posterity and for fans. So it's really been wonderful to work with her and to be able to have her story represented through the exhibition with some special items for her. So the archives don't hold a great deal of Priscilla's stuff, but some special things that really link strongly to Elvis's story in the archives, and of course her wedding dress is one of those things. So one more character to mention is the notorious Colonel Tom Parker. So look, I've chosen this quote. In the context of this quote, I think Tom Parker didn't speak to the media very much. I took this from a fairly rare interview, which I think was in about 1993. And I think he's saying this in the context of, I've never told my story, so no one will ever get their hands on it, so people will draw their own conclusions. Because I don't speak, mine will never be printed, is my understanding. He's sort of, you know, a bit of a notorious villain in fan circles, but obviously as a gallery we needed to stick to what is sort of documented in history, what we can reasonably kind of tell through objects and records. And his story is quite obscured. So all his professional kind of records about Elvis are now part of the Graceland archives, and you'll see there's a bit of correspondence that I've selected to display a letter where an Australian promoter has made an approach for $1 million for Elvis to come to Australia, and Parker's assistant has written back to say no dates, not available, and there were just dozens of those to choose from, so I just picked a couple to kind of symbolise that story. But really, you know, no one was privy to the relationship between Parker and Presley, so we will never really know what the kind of shape of their dynamic was, but it certainly, you know, made, and some would argue kind of curtailed, but certainly made his career. You know, Parker has worked with him from the very beginning, and, you know, more or less, and is fundamental to the story. So this is a great backstage picture of Elvis getting ready to go on the Ed Sullivan show. That's Ed Sullivan, Colonel Parker, and Elvis kind of, I mean, it just totally summarises their relationship. Elvis was like, don't talk to me about the business. I'll sign it, I trust you, I'm not going to read it. You know, he was totally focused on his performance and his creative practice. Parker handled the business, and Elvis, you know, something that is fundamentally Elvis, and I would say Presley, after our experience of working with Priscilla, is once they trust you, there is a great sense of like, we're in it for the long haul. And, you know, I say that because Priscilla has been with the same PA for 35 years. So there's a great sense of loyalty to, like, you know, trusted folks. And this is another great one from 1958 in recording studios during the King Creole sessions. So you can see Elvis is kind of in his off-duty army outfit. So he's on leave, 2 weeks leave from army service, and straight into the studio to work to record for King Creole, which those of you who are into Elvis films will know is often considered one of his best films and has a really good soundtrack by proper songwriters. So of course, one of the many things that Parker did was totally embed Elvis in the pop culture landscape, and one of the ways he did that was through merchandise. So you will have seen there are a couple of cases of 1956 Elvis Presley merch, like lipsticks and scarves and jewellery. That is but a small selection of merch that was produced that year. Parker flooded the market with Elvis stuff, cologne, paint sets, like you name it, he put Elvis's face on it and sold it. So that's Elvis trying on Elvis Presley tennis shoes. So I think, you know, probably this was almost like the first real example of just celebrity saturation in the public imagination, and this idea of kind of the celebrity as a brand or as a commodity. So now, you know, it's perfectly natural to walk into Chemist Warehouse and see Christina Aguilera perfume, but this, you know, Colonel arguably kind of, you know, invented this model. So it brings us to this, in the exhibition you'll see this little book that Elvis is signing for all the girls here. This is actually in Las Vegas. In Las Vegas in 1956, Elvis performed in Vegas and bombed. It's one of the rare kind of unsuccess stories in those early years. So when he first went to Vegas, it was like the days of the Rat Packers and Sinatra, and it was a much more sort of mature lounge club sort of audience, and Elvis just went down like a lead balloon. So when he returned to Vegas in the 70s, just kind of, you know, on the top of his game, I think there was probably an element of like personal kind of, I don't know, completion of some earlier chapter that he kind of returned to this city glorious after a bit of a fail. But you can see even then he had plenty of young fans at his hotel. And you'll see that he's actually signing like a little souvenir album that we have one in the exhibition. And it sort of brings me to the last thing that I wanted to focus on, which is Elvis's relationship to and appreciation for his fans. And I think we've got this beautiful quote, which is from kind of early on, I think. This is probably a quote from the late 50s. But it really does summarise Elvis's relationship with his fans. He, totally attributed his success to fan support, and he would often say, this could all go away tomorrow, and he never took fan support for granted. And there are so many beautiful photographs of him always stopping, meandering down the Graceland driveway to sign autographs at the gates, going to stage doors. We've had so many people through this exhibition send us personal photographs saying like, oh, this is my sister in 1970 getting a photograph with Elvis at the stage door at, the International Hotel or something. So he really did make time for his fans. And I think as someone who grew up poor, where his greatest dream was to sing on the radio, he could never have imagined fame on this level. I think he knew, like, the fans put me here and they could take it away tomorrow if they lost interest. And Priscilla, when she was here, talked about how his jumpsuits, more than just a spectacle or some sort of like, gaudy kind of display of wealth, they were about putting on a show for the fans. And that Elvis knew, for many of his fans, they might have saved up for years. This was their one big treat, the one chance to see him, and he wanted it to be like a special, memorable, once-in-a-lifetime night for them. And if you look at concert footage, we have some in the exhibition, he's always interacting with his audience. And I guess for me, this sort of also made me reflect on the toll that his fame took on him. And there were so many people who hitched their wagon to Elvis. And I guess as a curator, it sort of made me think, well, I'm also one of those people now, 50 years on. So many people who were kind of, invested, wanted a piece of the action, and as we know, the world is very different now. We have like a different conversation around the pressures of life in the public eye. But he really burnt the candle at both ends, and passed. He was my age when he died, 42. So you get a real sense of his generosity and his love for the fans. And I think it was lovely having Priscilla here because I'm gesturing to Rosie, who looked after Priscilla a lot when she was here, like Priscilla's chaperone. I think Priscilla really still embodies that ethos of not taking it for granted, wanting to match fans' sort of passion and generosity by making that time and being sincere in return. And there he is this is one of his final concerts. Those of you who know Elvis's concerts by his jumpsuits will know this sundial jumpsuit was one of the last he ever wore, and often at Graceland, we don't have it in the exhibition, and that was one that could not leave Graceland, but they often display it from the back. As a sort of symbol of Elvis's departure. And here he is throwing a scarf out, and one of the things that, make sure you see in the final room, which is sort of the red room that talks about, his performance on stage and his relationship with fans, is there's a road case packed up for the next tour that he should have gone on, that he never went on in 77, of these scarves that he would take specifically to sort of wear around his neck for a few minutes and then give out to fans as little souvenirs of their night. So that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you. I think we're nearly at time, but would anyone like to ask a question? Would you like a drink? Would anyone like to, don't be shy, I can ask a question. Margaret.
I'm just wondering, with all the archive, is it all stored still at Graceland?
Yeah, so the question was, is the archive all stored at Graceland? And yes, it is, if you've been there, or if and when you get the opportunity to go. The actual house, like the original, they call it the Memphis Mansion, although not really a mansion, it's actually a very kind of humble scale house in many ways. That's on one side of the road, and then on the other side of the road is a big kind of, almost like a showgrounds complex where they have shops and diners and exhibition spaces. And the archives buildings are over there, although they're not open to the public. They're sort of secure and discreet to the side. But yeah, everything is stored there. I believe they have some other storage as well, but it's a huge archive. Like, could not believe how much was in there. All the old furniture from every redecoration of Graceland, all of Vernon's sort of personal business, goings on at Graceland files, and all of Parker's professional tour
files, which are vast, you know, just because it was like touring before smartphones and the internet, so papers and papers and papers for every single detail relating to the tours, like just looking at it now, it's like, oh, this is like the files of a micromanager. But actually, I think it was just the files of a manager before the internet, where you couldn't just assume you can figure anything out on the road. So yeah, they are all there, and it's, you know, it's an extraordinary resource they have. I don't know if there's any other celebrity on earth that has this.
Is Priscilla still very involved in the whole Graceland's, exhibits?
Yeah, is Priscilla involved in Graceland's exhibits? Yes, she does seem to be. I mean, they have a obviously professional staff and a head of archives and archivists, but my feeling is that Priscilla's, you know, maybe not involved necessarily in a sort of practical managing sense, but there's a strong closeness and a strong sense of, I mean, to be honest, in some ways it felt like quite a family culture. And she certainly kind of was always given previews to things, and there's a sense of checking in with her about, like, is this faithful to, you know, your experiences and the way you want the story told. So yes, day to day, she doesn't live in Memphis, she lives in LA, but she goes there a lot. She was there when I was there in January because it was Elvis's birthday. So she will often go for special events during the year to see fans and check in with the team and I guess review upcoming projects and so on. And my sense was that, you know, throughout the development of this project, there were lots of like check-ins with her. So yeah, I think she's still pretty closely involved.
Was she the one that sort of dug them out of bankruptcy, I suppose?
Yes, I mean, look, I don't know all the corporate history, but yeah, the way she told it when she was here is that they were in big trouble financially. And, you know, there was this very expensive kind of estate and grounds and staff, all of Elvis's staff, that I guess by 82, you know, he'd been gone for 5 years, and Vernon, his father, had been gone, I guess, for maybe 3 or 4 by that point. I think Vernon passed away in 79, maybe. So yes, I think she was an executor of the estate, and I think basically her goal, the way she explained it to the media when she was here, was just to kind of get through the next year, like just bring it back from the brink of having to sell. And, you know, they kind of sold 500 tickets and that was pretty good. And then they thought, okay, that's probably all the Elvis fans now. And then, you know, just built and built and built every year. And now it's this huge, thriving kind of business. So yeah, I think, you know, she was instrumental in that. And look, she has, you know, she talked about, she appointed a CEO, a guy called Jack Soden, who's still there, who kind of researched it and set it up with her. So it has, you know, it has a proper professional staff as well as Priscilla, but I think she sort of had this strategic kind of idea of what it could be and what its importance is culturally. Is there another hand somewhere?
I was just going to say, is it true that he was taken advantage of by, you know, like Colonel and all his...
Yes, good question. I think it would depend who you ask. I mean, it's hard. I don't think anyone can really know what was discussed and agreed between them because their relationship was very private. But no, I would say, like, the way Priscilla responded to similar questions was that Elvis knew his mind, and, you know, decisions that he made or the Colonel made were kind of agreed between them in private, and, you know, there were lots of factors at play. But yeah, I mean, I think if you talk to his biographers or his fans who are very knowledgeable, there is a feeling that, you know, Elvis maybe had his creative wings clipped, and the Colonel wanted to tightly control, you know, what opportunities he was allowed to pursue. But I think, you know, we'll probably never know the full truth of it. Yeah. There's plenty of speculation online if you want to keep reading, more than I can probably say. All right, everyone. Well, maybe we'll leave it there, especially for those of you who have tickets and need to get over the road. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the exhibition. And thanks for coming today. And yeah, enjoy.
Thank you.